6 minutes after 10 o'clock, we're into the second hour of Power Talk this morning. All right, let's talk now in our legal feature about immigration law and refugee and citizenship law. And I think it's an important topic given what we've all seen over the last couple of weeks. We want to know what there is in law regarding these different categories, how it affects South Africans, and also those of us who want to visit other parts of the world. What are the rules of venturing around the planet? So there are various categories in in this discussion about immigration law. And so I think the person best placed to speak about it is Craig Smith, who's the principal attorney at Craig Smith and Associates, and they focus on immigration law specifically. So Craig, good morning to you and welcome to Power Talk.
Yes, good morning, Iman. Happy to be here.
All right, so maybe just, I think for those of us who are wondering, how broad does the immigration and the migration category spread, perhaps give us a nice little neat overview.
Okay. Well, immigration is our Immigration Act, which was amended last year, 26th of May 2014, effectively covers all foreigners entering, continuing to stay and depart from the Republic. So effectively, the Department of Home Affairs, which is the administration tasked by government to oversee immigration, will set in place a policy which in turn becomes passed through Parliament. And so we have our Immigration Act, and then we have our immigration regulations, which is enabling laws or regulations or subordinate legislation, which the minister directly passes or promulgates through the Government Gazette. And together, those two pieces of law are instrumental in regulating the foreigners' arrivals and continued stay and departure. In those two pieces of law, they will obviously set out a series of categories for which an applicant must qualify. And
there are four main ones, Craig, if I understand. So there's permanent South African residence permits, temporary South African residence permits, immigration legal services, and then immigration litigation services, which covers the other categories, I imagine.
Well, in essence, the Immigration Act is almost divided into three main areas. That is temporary residence. Those are for foreigners wishing to enter on a stay of up to 5 years, and that would generally cover the likes of study visas, work visas, retirement visas, exchange visas, and the like. These are generally visas that go up to 5 years. Then there would be permanent residence, and there would be a series of categories. Some are duplicated from the temporary residence, like retirement category. You can even get permanent residence through asylum. You can get it through running your own business. You can get it through having a work permit.
And marriage. And marriage to a South African.
Yes, indeed. Correct. That is a very important category. That's what we call the Section 26B category, which says that if you marry to a South African or in a permanent relationship as prescribed, assuming you meet the checklist for 5 years, you will then qualify for permanent residence. And last but not least, there are the aspects of enforcement, and this is where the department authorizes immigration officers who are trained in the field of enforcement of the Immigration Act. And those principally are the three areas of regulating immigration affairs within South Africa.
Is it fairly complicated to navigate these different categories? I mean, one imagines that for work, study, and exchange, it would be a fairly straightforward process. When does it start to get complicated?
Well, Iman, that's a very good question. I mean, it started to get complicated when the laws changed, and principally because new applicants would have to apply from their home countries. So you would have foreign people who have the necessary wherewithal to qualify, be it business, be it skills in terms of critical skills, etc. They would certainly qualify. The difficulty they would have is to navigate around the immigration laws to determine what is expected of them. So they are sitting, for example, they could be sitting in Germany wishing to apply, and they've got to research this in order to determine what they need to apply, what requirements are required, and then secondly, to actually go and submit the application now at the nearest South African mission. So they are a little bit isolated from the going-ons in South Africa, and that is a principal challenge for new applicants. Of course, when you have an existing visa, you can remain in the Republic and do a change of status, which is not as complicated, but invariably we find that the average foreign person who's seeking guidance is largely in a position of confusion as to what is required, because now you have to apply through a VFS center in South Africa who are not in an advisory capacity, are simply a postbox. So you may find an applicant who is qualified in actual fact provides an application that is deficient. And that is unfortunate because they'll face a rejection. And that's where the problem starts.
All right. What I want to do, Craig, is maybe go through some of the broader categories that are perhaps more used in South Africa. So there's the two things. The one is, people who might get in on a particular visa and then, as you say, have that altered later on. And the main intention there is to at least get into the country and then to reevaluate and reassess their positions once they're here and get a change done. Yes. So that's the one. We'll get to that in a second. But perhaps talk us through the one where a foreign national comes into South Africa, meets someone that they want to settle with in South Africa. What process then unfolds, and how long does it typically take for them to get South African citizenship? And perhaps what some of the dual nationality rights or access to rights would be for their offspring in that scenario?
Yeah, look, Iman, effectively there's a hierarchy of status in essence. But let's just say you're a foreign person. Let's just say you're married or you're clearly in a permanent relationship with a South African citizen. Let's go back to Germany, or obviously could be anywhere in the world. You would first be tasked with going through the process of eligibility to determine whether you qualify. Now, there are two ways. You could either apply from abroad, and now you've got to demonstrate to Home Affairs that you are indeed either married through the marriage certificate, or B, you're in a permanent relationship, and then you need to comply with certain tangible evidence to show you're in a relationship. If you get that right, you will qualify for a spousal visa, which in turn also allows you to work or run a business and study. It's an endorsement which you can attach in your application. So you can either do this application abroad, and the only other time you can do it in South Africa is effectively if you have an existing visa. So you may be on a study visa and meet a South African, and on that basis you can change within South Africa. The hierarchy of status then elevates from a temporary resident to then, let's just say, that same foreign person after 5 years of marriage or permanent relationship will qualify for permanent residence, and thereafter for a further 5 years in accordance with the Citizenship Act, they would qualify for South African citizenship. The Citizenship Act has been changed, amended on the 1st of January 2013, and there are certain anomalies we've picked up between the Act and the regulation.
All right, talk us through that.
Yeah. The anomalies, generally, it was always a case like this, where you would effectively want to naturalize as a South African, because there are three ways of becoming a South African citizen. You can either qualify by birth, if either of your parents are South African citizens and you're born in South Africa, or out of South Africa. That's the new change. You effectively you only now have a category of citizenship by birth, and descent is not what it used to be in the past. And then lastly, you can qualify for South African citizenship via naturalization. And this is where, through the evolution of time and holding permanent residence, you would then be eligible to apply for citizenship, which generally is a 5-year period. There is an anomaly in the regulations that talks about a 10-year period, and I'm not certain if this has since been remedied by the Department of Home Affairs, who are responsible for issuing these regulations. But effectively, citizenship by naturalization is the main form of citizenship that is obtained via foreigners who are here having permanent residence, and then through the passing of time would indeed qualify for South African citizenship. Once again, there are a series of requirements, and most importantly, as long as one of the key requirements would be to show a South African police clearance to ensure that you have no criminal conduct and, you're of good and sound character.
An important question in that regard, Craig, would be in the naturalization process, if you can prove that you've been in South Africa. And as you say, there are some anomalies in the law as to whether that period is 5 or 10 years. So, that might be a little bit of a question mark. But can you do that without marrying someone?
Yes, of course. I mean, as long as you hold permanent residence, in the old Citizenship Act, it was actually quite advantageous for a marital couple. So let's just say the foreigner has permanent residence and is married to a South African. You merely had to wait 2 years. No longer is that available of foreign spouses who have permanent residence. So now you have to wait 5 years, as in the case of, for example, anyone else who's acquired permanent residence through another category. You could, for argument's sake, have permanent residence through 5 years holding a work visa. On that basis, you can show through the passing of time that you would qualify as a naturalized South African citizen.
Yeah.
So the long and short of it is you need to have permanent residence, one, and you need to have permanent residence for a period of time. And secondly, when you determine that period of time, you can't have absences from the Republic unless you were a South African citizen. So to make up those 5 years, you can't, for example, be 2 years abroad and then come back and say, well, I've had permanent residence for 5 years.
Yeah.
So there are certain requirements in terms of a continued stay.
Anecdotally speaking, from your practice's point of view, because we try to get a national picture from Home Affairs, and that figure wasn't forthcoming. I don't think that we have an accurate 2015 contemporary understanding of the conversions and the numbers and how many people are documented and not. So anecdotally speaking, from the work that you do in your practice, how many people seek those conversions? How many go from permanent residency to becoming naturalized citizens of South Africa? How many are seeking things like permanent residency based on a marriage union or marriage contract?
Well, look, I mean, over the last 10 years, when the Immigration Act was changed quite fundamentally in 2004, which took effect 1st of July 2005, all the way through to the new change last year, we had a very open immigration-friendly policy towards foreign entrants. So you had a huge number of applications being submitted for temporary residence and permanent residence. Home Affairs was a lot more amenable and open to picking up the phone and phoning the applicants to ask for certain matters or certain paperwork that was maybe not in the original application. Ever since the 26th of May 2014, Home Affairs has tightened up on the good old telephone call to say, look, you may not have a South African police clearance, kindly supply. So their attitude has hardened tremendously towards the requirement, so they are simply rejecting out of hand. They are rejecting applications even where you are married. A foreign person is married to a South African. So what we principally find is there's been an attitudinal change, and this in turn has affected the foreign applicants' approach to applying for certain visas. For example, the general work visa has made it quite, administratively difficult to get one. Basically, the Department of Home Affairs has delegated the main duties onto the Department of Labor, who literally would have the right to attend on the employer's premises to determine all the nuts and bolts around this prospective employee. So employers don't necessarily want to get too involved in that.
Yeah.
So general work visas have dropped astronomically. In my practice, for example, where we used to do a very high number of general work visas, applicants are seeking, are not able to take advantage of a general work visa, and they have to look for other categories, or not at all, or leave the country. So what you are certainly finding is that the new immigration laws are not only in substance, but certainly in the manner in which it's being applied, is becoming becoming restrictive and almost a deterrent for many foreign people to stay. And this does not necessarily pertain to unskilled and semi-skilled. This may even pertain to people who have invested in South Africa, who have bought property in South Africa, who are wanting to pack up and go. Despite the lifestyle you can have and the opportunities that are here. This is unfortunate.
One of our listeners wants to know, and this is Ricky Marima asking about spousal visa modalities. This is for foreign spouses or the foreign aspect in a marriage or in a marriage contract who've been married to a South African, so a foreigner married to a South African for less than 5 years. Are there any specific visa modalities and requirements? I'm not quite sure what the question is asking specifically, but are there different caveats in what you can and cannot get?
Well, what is there was a constitutional case of Darwood with the Minister of Home Affairs, who certainly made our laws very progressive towards foreign spouses with South Africans, and this decision was welcomed many years ago. In terms of the requirements for a spousal visa, let's just take the marriage scenario. Generally, when you are married and you present your marriage certificate, assuming it's properly authenticated, you should not have any difficulties, obviously assuming you're complying with the other general requirements. What is often happening is to many applicants is they're applying for their spousal visa. So here you have a South African with a foreign spouse, they may even have children, and they're applying, and little do they know, and they're applying without legal assistance. And they apply and, for example, omit to supply the South African police clearance. The Home Affairs is not providing any grace in this adjudication. They're simply rejecting the application. So whilst you may be married, you may forget one of the general requirements. For example, a South African police clearance, which you may consider rather unnecessary, but from a Home Affairs point of view, it is. And this is where it's difficult for an individual layperson to determine what the immigration laws are. And regrettably, you then end up facing a potential rejection. The rejection may culminate in that particular foreign person now leaving the country and being rendered undesirable, a family being separated where they are with a South African and a foreigner. Now, and that's rather, that's rather, in my view, that's unacceptable. And I mean, that certainly goes against the grain of precedent in our constitutional court as the way we should be treating spouses with a South African.
Can I ask Craig Smith if there is a surrendering of a person's original nationality in becoming a South African citizen, or do we allow? And I know that certainly in the British context, I know people who have dual citizenship of places in the UK or European in Europe and South Africa, and I imagine that applies to the continent as well.
Yes, in terms of citizenship, you can have dual citizenship. South Africa many years ago was averse to dual citizenship. Insofar as acquiring South African citizenship whilst you're, for argument's sake, a UK or US citizen. In those countries, they permit dual citizenship. So as long as when you do apply, you get the consent from that country that you are entitled to dual citizenship, Home Affairs will want to see that your particular nationality permits you to have a South African citizenship as well. There are some countries that certainly will not permit a dual citizenship, and that's where you will encounter the problem. So it would be a situation where you literally would have to renounce your right to South African citizenship. Let's just say if you wanted to take foreign citizenship, they may request you renounce. Whereas in the UK and those countries, US, Australia, many European countries, you can have dual citizenship and they'll accept South African citizenship plus their own original citizenship. The procedure for South Africa is that you just have to get confirmation and consent from your own consular office as to whether they will permit that. And then South Africa will grant it.
I'm interested in something you said early on in the interview, Craig Smith. You were talking about, Home Affairs toughening up and making the requirements for certain categories a little bit more difficult. We're dealing in a context where a lot of blame is being apportioned to Home Affairs in the way that they've run their affairs vis-a-vis bribery and corruption, in giving people documents in exchange for money and stuff like that, and perpetuating this idea that, people can get into South Africa by any means and have the paperwork to prove that they're here legitimately without having gone through the proper channels. But from your perspective as a practice, the way that you have sought to seek documentation and to go through the bureaucratic process, it does show that there has been a bit more stringent adherence to the rules and a tightening up of the allowances?
Well, look, at the end of the day, Home Affairs has adopted a restrictive policy towards immigration. The question is whether that policy is balanced or not. I mean, Home Affairs will tell you that in the interest of national security, we need to tighten up our immigration laws and make them restrictive. And South Africa is not open to everyone. And I've debated that with senior officials before. And I think we need to concede that in the interest of national security, on the one hand, that's good. But on the other hand, the question remains from a matter of policy whether it is correct in simply having such a restrictive policy, which, within a human rights environment which we now have, whether there's perhaps a better balance. Immigration and Home Affairs also has to deal with the refugee aspect. And in the refugee aspect, we have the Refugees Act. And obviously a lot has been said about undocumented economic migrants coming from all over Africa in the main, some from Pakistan, to come to South Africa to seek better opportunities. And I think there has been, I think Home Affairs need to accept some of the blame, because the manner in which they've catered for the asylum seekers has been found wanting in terms of their ability to process them timeously. And if they're rejected, then they should be rejected and then they should be sent back. But regrettably, the department just has failed in its infrastructure and its organization to deal with many of these asylum seekers, and then effectively end up staying here for years and years and years. And then when Home Affairs policy gets even stricter, they've already entrenched themselves within the community in South Africa.
Yeah.
So, there's obviously a lot of xenophobia at the moment. It is important, and in fact, it's a stated intention in the Immigration Act to countenance xenophobia, to involve civic organizations, educate people on immigration rights. And as I say, in the refugee circles, I mean, this cannot be separated from immigration. So within the refugee realm, you are finding the negative consequences of what I would consider bad organization, where these asylum seekers have just simply crossed the border. There's been inefficient controls over them. They've stayed longer than they should have, and this is what we have. But we have a constitution, so we can't just arbitrarily kick these people out. They have to have a right now to proper adjudication. And when South Africa many years subscribed to the international covenants on refugee states, refugee affairs, they bound themselves to comply with human rights in dealing with refugees.
Craig, you've answered in that some of the questions our other listeners have been asking. Very quickly, I don't have much time left. The V listing. This is a person who I imagine in some ways has been determined, a persona non grata. How long does that category last? Is it indefinite, or can you rehabilitate yourself?
No, you can rehabilitate yourself. It's an interesting question, because ordinarily in the old law, you could rehabilitate yourself after 4 years, apply to the V-listing section at Home Affairs to say that you've mended your way. And based on that application, they could then lift the V-listing. V-listing has become obviously more serious now and a lot busier than they used to be, because we now have people who are being banned from the country in terms of this new law where if you leave the country, you're rendered, and you have an overstay on the face of it, you are rendered undesirable and made a persona non grata. The most unfortunate thing about that is you could have very good reasons why you need to leave the country. You may leave because there's a personal, there could be you may need to attend a funeral. You could have a close one who's ill. And for a number of reasons. I mean, you have the constitutional right to leave the country if you so wish, yet you would be banned, you would be declared undesirable, you would effectively be relisted, and they affect you know, from anything from 1 to 5 years, and then you're going to have to apply to the department for good cause to see whether they would lift it.
And they would
But if they
reevaluate.
don't, then you've got, then
All
you
right.
need to rehabilitate yourself.
All right, Craig, it's been a very informative discussion. Thank you very much for sharing with us on Power
It's a
Talk.
pleasure.
Appreciate it. Go well. Craig Smith is from Craig Smith and Associates. It is just after 10:30.